On the evening he captured the premiership, he reflected on how great the 3-mile journey had been from his boyhood in Cold Harbour Lane, Brixton, to number 10 Downing Street. His colleagues say he opened his first cabinet meeting with the words, "Who would have believed it?" Sir John Major, welcome. It was a long way from Brixton to number 10. It's an extraordinary story of a suburban upbringing and tough times in Brixton to the highest office in the land. And when were the seeds of ambition first planted in you? When were you first aware that you wanted to do something big in public and political life?
I think probably about the age of 13. And I think what influenced me most was what Harold Macmillan would have called events, dear boy, events. It was what I saw and what I experienced that made me realise that I would like to take part in public life to see if I could change some things. I always had a fascination for history. And the first time I ever went in the House of Commons, at the invitation of a Labour MP, actually, Marcus Lipton, the member for Brixton, there is a special atmosphere in that building, and it reaches out and it grabs you. I thought to myself, this is where I'd like to work.
But where does the Conservative impulse come from? It's a crude way of looking at it, but so many do in our class-obsessed country. You were from the wrong side of the tracks, to use an American phrase, and yet you had no doubt that you were a Conservative. This was the way to do it, to get those beneficial public changes.
At the time, when I was 12, 13, 14, we lived in Brixton, 5 members of the family in 2 rooms and a little landing upon which we cooked, and the washroom 3 floors down. And the Labour Party in Lambeth were very big-hearted. Their attitude generally was, yes, you are in difficulties, and in due course we will help you, but be patient. And the Conservative Party said to me, we'd like to open up avenues of opportunity for you to change your own circumstances and those of your own family. And of the 2 philosophies, there was no doubt which one appealed to me. So I was, by instinct, Conservative. I'm not an ideologue in any way, and what attracts me is what pragmatically can be done, not whether it meets some ideological test or other.
In your memoirs, you have a very vivid section about your hatred of class obsessions in our dear country. You said, I was in earnest about classlessness. I wanted to say that the subtle calibrations of scorn in which this country rejoices, the endless putting downs and belittlings, so instinctive that we don't notice ourselves doing them, are awful. Now, there's passion and there's pain in there. Were you patronised as a young man from South London in that old Conservative Party by the grander figures?
You see, there is an assumption there that it was the Conservative Party that was being patronising. And if that was so, why would I join them? In fact, it wasn't so much that, it was more the way life behaved. The fact that there were glass ceilings on opportunity for many people depending upon their background, that there were different social values applied to people who had blue-collar jobs and people who had white-collar jobs. There was a different social value placed on immigration. I saw immigrants at very close quarters in the 1950s. They shared my house. They were my neighbours. I played with them as boys. And I didn't see people who'd come here just to benefit from our social system. I saw people with the guts and the drive to travel halfway across the world in many cases to better themselves and their families. And I think that's a very Conservative instinct to do that. That's what I saw. And it was things like that. And also the fear I saw amongst many people who had nothing, perhaps unsophisticated as well. I saw a fear of officialdom among them. And it was things like that that made me think there are changes that can be made, and they can better be made from a Conservative attitude than from any other attitude.
In those formative years, you seemed very at ease with Harold Macmillan and Rab Butler and Ian MacLeod, the classic one nation formulation Conservative. And Napoleon used to say, if you want to understand a man or woman in authority, think of the world as it was when they were 20 or 21. And you are from that era, that post-war, relatively consensual era of concerned conservatism. And is that the key to John Major, really?
Certainly I felt comfortable with it. I much prefer consensus to disagreement. If you can reach consensus, so much the better. And certainly of the politicians of those days, I think above all it was Ian MacLeod who most attracted my attention as a young teenager. Firstly, because of what he said, which was uplifting. And secondly, because of the way he said it, which was compelling. He had some form of paralysis of the neck, which kept his head absolutely unmoving. And he had a voice like a ringing bell. And it was inspiring to listen to. And certainly as a 11, 12, 13, 14-year-old, if I could hear Ian MacLeod speak, I would. And I drank in every word.
You're a man of immense application and tenacity, but why didn't you work at school, at Rutledge Grammar School? Why did it all come later? I know people fire up at different points in their intellectual life, but it's a bit of a mystery, that, John.
Well, not to me. Circumstances at home weren't easy. My father was very sick and was plainly at the beginning of dying. My mother was very sick. There were lots of domestic problems. I had to travel from Brixton to Wimbledon each day. There were difficulties that sat in the forefront of my mind far more than studying. And so I suppose in the rather in the way young people do, I withdrew from what I should have been doing, which was studying, and concentrated on other matters. I knew I was doing it, and I knew I was foolish in doing it, but I couldn't not do it. And then the moment I left school, I knew I had to study, and I had to make up for that.
And you certainly did, and you came in the great rush of new Conservative MPs in May 1979, and pretty rapid rise. You're in the Whip's office, first of all, and record has it you had the most furious row with Mrs Thatcher quite early on.
But that's absolutely true.
Not entirely a career-enhancing move, one would have thought.
Well, it turned out to be so, actually, because she is an extraordinary set of contradictions. These days, when you talk of Margaret Thatcher, you have to draw a distinction between the Margaret Thatcher of legend, promoted by her opponents and by her adherents, and the real Margaret Thatcher, the flesh and blood Margaret Thatcher that I knew. It's certainly true that we had a colossal row. It was the fashion in those days for the Chief Whip to invite the Prime Minister for a dinner once a year with the Whips. And she came, and after 2 minutes she had exhausted the social chit-chat that she loathed so much. And so we sat down to dinner, and John Wakeham said, well, the economy's central.
He was the Chief Whip.
John was the Chief Whip at the time. The economy's central, he said. I'll ask the Treasury Whip, John Major, to talk about what the party's view is. So I told her. And the party's view wasn't what she wished to hear. And so she decided, rather than enter into debate, she would shoot the messenger, which she attempted to do in spectacular style. And I responded in equal style, that may not be what she wished to hear, but that's what the party thought, and that's what I was going to tell her. And the argument went on for some time. And one or two of the whips came up to me afterwards and said, well, that was a short career. And the following day, I was the whip on duty, sitting on the green benches in a sparse house. And Margaret came and sat next to me and said, I've been thinking about what you said last night. We ought to have a further meeting to discuss it. And she went into the Whip's office and convened a further meeting. And about 3 weeks later, she had a reshuffle and appointed me a junior minister at the Department of Health and Social Security in the job in which she herself had started and which she thought was a good learning job. So there's a curious contradiction. She behaved pretty unreasonably in the conversation, and then afterwards, the other side of Margaret appeared. She didn't say I was wrong, but she put right what had gone wrong and then promoted me.
Mrs Thatcher must have seen something very special in you from that extraordinary set to. She said you were the one that she wanted to succeed the night you took over. But did she realise that you were quite such right through one nation? Did you think she was misreading you, and did you allow her to misread you?
No, I didn't. I mean, if she did misread me, I'm puzzled as to how that happened. Because both as Chief Secretary and as Chancellor, and briefly as Foreign Secretary, a glorious 94 days in which we went to war with no one, and briefly as Foreign Secretary, I saw a great deal of Margaret Thatcher one-to-one. And we didn't always agree. And we did have a relationship where I could say to her what I thought. I didn't have to temper what I thought, and I didn't temper what I thought. So I find it difficult to understand how she could have misunderstood what my views were, because they were expressed often enough.
Do you think you were ready for the Premiership in 1990? Would you like to have done longer time in one of the big...
Yes, I would. Yes, I would.
Why was that? What did you think you were missing still?
I think I was missing the fact that the longer you have been in government, the more experience you have, I would have preferred it if I had become Prime Minister a few years later. I think that would have been easier in terms of how I felt about it, and I think it would have been easier in terms of the experience I was able to bring to the job. But if the ball comes your way, you grab it. There's nothing else you could do.
When you become Prime Minister, the whole weight of special responsibilities fall upon you, including the most awesome one, which I've written a little bit about, which is having to do the nuclear weapons stuff, the last resort letters. And I was very struck when David Cameron told me on the record that when he had to do what he wanted from beyond the grave, if we were wiped out by a nuclear bolt from the blue, he told me he called you in and asked for your advice. It's the most awesome thing that falls upon a new Prime Minister. So how did you prepare yourself for it? And later, how did you help David Cameron prepare for writing down those extraordinary letters to go on the submarines?
It is a shock. The first I realised that I was going to have to write post-Armageddon instructions to our 4 Trident submarines was when the Cabinet Secretary told me. And it is quite an extraordinary introduction to the Premiership. And I remember I went away over the weekend and I thought about it a lot. And it was one of the most difficult things I ever had to do, to write those instructions. The essence of them being, if the UK is wiped out, but its Trident submarines are at sea with their weaponry, what should they then do with their weaponry? And eventually I reached a conclusion and I set it out. And I talked to David about that. I'm not going to say what I said, but we discussed the parameters of it. And I left him to make his own decision, as he did.
Soon after you became Prime Minister, I mean, actually straight away, given the condition of the Middle East, you were engaged in the run-up to the First Gulf War.
A few days before the war started, I went to Saudi Arabia to meet the then exiled Kuwaiti royal family and reassure them that Britain would be with the United States because their closeness to the United Kingdom was and is remarkable. And I also went to visit the troops. And there were several things that struck me about that. The first was how young they were. And I remember standing on a tank talking to thousands of them. And I knew, though they did not, that the war would begin on the 16th of January, and this was just a few days earlier. And as I spoke to them, all these boys sitting there, their faces metamorphosed into those of my son, whose 16th birthday was the date at which war began. A year or so older, and he could have been part of them, and all their faces morphed into my sons when I was talking to them. And that is a memory of war I've never forgotten.
There's a paradox in your premiership from the early years when, as you like to put it, you felt you were living in sin with the electorate because you hadn't got your own majority, which you did get against expected political form in '92. But then troubles come in battalions, and they came in battalions in the autumn of late summer and early autumn of 1992. And so once you had your majority, the gods of politics can be very malign. They dumped on you, John, didn't they? And it must be quite painful for you looking back to see that paradox, because once you were no longer living in sin with the electorate, your party erupted around you. Black Wednesday and the European question asserting itself again.
Of course, the party changed in 1992. A large number of the last remnants of the post-war generation who had been in the war and who thought anything was better than having another European war. They had lived through one and had memories of the first earlier in the century. And they were prepared to make accommodations to bring Europe together so there could never again be another European war. But they were succeeded by a new young group of conservatives who'd grown up in a much more ideological age, with a much more ideological bent, and without the historic memory of the war and its immediate aftermath. So the parliamentary party that was so difficult after 1992 was a different, significantly different parliamentary party from the party that had existed throughout the 70s, 80s, and the early part of the 90s. And then what significantly changed it was the collapse of sterling falling out of the exchange rate mechanism.
16th of September 1992, a day that you'll always remember.
16th of September 1992.
So
now, I'm
vividly.
unlikely to forget it.
Yeah.
I'm unlikely to forget it. But of course, the background to it was forgotten. The background to it was totally forgotten. Why did we go into the exchange rate mechanism? Why did Margaret Thatcher sign up to the exchange rate mechanism? And she did. And she did.
You persuaded her, and Douglas Hurd, the Foreign Secretary, did, didn't you?
We talked to her, and she was persuaded. And she wasn't, as some have said, persuaded with a pistol held to her head. I will tell you exactly why Margaret agreed to go into the exchange rate mechanism. Because as she came to the end of her premiership, we were suffering the recession that so often follows a boom. And there had been a boom in the late 1980s, and we were now heading into the recession. Inflation, on the day I became Prime Minister and just before it, was very nearly 10%. Unemployment was soaring. Interest rates were 14%, and we were undoubtedly heading for a deep recession. Now, Margaret cared about inflation. They hurt the people that she knew. She wanted to bring inflation down. And that is why she decided we would go into the exchange rate mechanism. Because every time in her political life and mine, we had had an anti-inflationary policy, the government had given way when it got difficult. And the exchange rate mechanism produced a clear external discipline to bring inflation down. And so concerned about that was she, that she actually wished to go into the exchange rate mechanism at a more punitive exchange rate than the one we chose. So the argument that Margaret was unwillingly pushed into the exchange rate mechanism is utterly, utterly false. But then, of course, when we crashed out, it was taken by the Eurosceptics as a classic reason to pile in on Europe on every conceivable front. And that, of course, is what happened. It was a great calamity, a political calamity that we came out. What is frustrating about that is that we had already been discussing privately within government. I had been discussing with the policy unit and others how we could come out of the exchange rate mechanism without causing too much disruption and without the market believing we had given up our anti-inflationary credentials. And the crisis hit us, and we were toppled out of the exchange rate mechanism before we could reach a conclusion on how to come out voluntarily. And that, of course, seasoned everything that followed.
It was almost the end of your premiership in the sense that you seriously thought you might have to go, sort of honourable resignation, and that thereafter you've also been very honest that you were prone to depression as Prime Minister because of that calamity.
I was never sure whether I should have resigned or not. I asked the views of people I respected like Douglas Hurd and I think Norman Fowler, and also people who were not politicians, about whether I should resign. And their view, maybe people always give this view to people who say that, I don't know, but their view was unequivocally that I shouldn't, and that if a Prime Minister did resign a few months after winning an election, that the government itself was doomed. Now, whether that was the right decision to stay on or not, I have never been certain. I have never been absolutely certain.
You're still not sure?
I don't think you can ever be certain. It's not something that haunts me now, but the truth of the matter is I was never certain whether it was the right or wrong decision. But it did have several effects. I was never in any doubt that winning the 1997 election would be very difficult. The day after the 92 election, Chris Patten and I sat in the White Room at number 10.
He just lost his seat.
Chris had lost his seat at Bath. And we agreed that in winning a fourth successive term, we had stretched the democratic elastic as far as it would go, and that we, unless Labour collapsed, we would have little chance of winning the next election. I was reinforced in that view by the impact of Black Wednesday. I thought it overwhelmingly likely that we would have lost. In one sense, that was liberating. It meant I could go ahead and do, as Sarah Hogg, for one, repeatedly said to me,
your head of policy unit,
the head of my policy unit, you can now do what you think is right. You don't have to politically trim. You can do what you think is right. And economically, we did. And if I may say so, people now these days forget the dire economic circumstances on the 30th of November 1990.
When you become Prime Minister.
When I became Prime Minister. And the fact that we handed on to the Labour Party in 1997, by common consent, the best economy any government has handed on to its successors probably at any time in the 20th century. And people forget that. And they forget other things that happened after Black Wednesday, the Northern Ireland peace process, which was extraordinarily difficult to start, but extraordinarily worthwhile.
I think history will linger on that, because you opened the back channel to the IRA after they'd approached the MI6 back channel saying the war's over, we need advice on how to finish it. That was an enormous risk, and it was kept very secret, as it had to be. But it started the road to where we are now.
I remember the afternoon that message came in. I was sitting in number 10. It was a grisly, grey, late afternoon. And my principal private secretary came in bearing a message saying, we're not sure what to make of this. And that was the famous message about bringing the conflict to an end. And I discussed it with the Northern Ireland Secretary, Patrick Mayhew, and we realised that if this went wrong, it would be the end of our political careers, because we would have been seen as being dupes of the IRA and foolish and naive and all those things. On the other hand, if we made progress, it would save people's lives. So that was the judgment, looking foolish on one hand and perhaps making progress and saving lives on the other. So we were in no doubt about what we should do. But there was a lot of opposition to what we did, both within the cabinet and in the Conservative Party particularly. I received a lot of support then from the Labour Party and the Liberal Party, but I was never sure quite where the balance of opinion was in my own party.
I'm very struck by Sarah Hogg saying, now you can be yourself, a sense of liberation, as you put it. I've always had the impression, though, John, that if you could do it again, you would have been even more yourself. There are certain things you would have done if you'd followed your instincts, despite perhaps difficulties, one of which would be to put a lot more funding into the NHS, or another area you've always been keen on, which is open government.
Well,
but you may have some regrets that you weren't even more the John Major, the inner John Major, than you actually turned out to be, 92 to 97.
Well, it wasn't just political inhibitions. It was money. I mentioned earlier the terrible economic recession that we had at the beginning of the 1990s. We spent the best part of 5 to 6 years putting that right. And it was very unpopular putting that right. And of course, when you're doing that, you do not have the resources, or in some ways the political capital with a tiny majority, which was shrinking all the time, to actually make those sort of changes. And I couldn't, because we were preoccupied with the economy. We were overwhelmed with disputes about Europe. Northern Ireland also took a great deal of time. But in terms of the social reforms I would like to have made, I'm not sure we would have had the majority for them in the House of Commons. But above all, we didn't have the money for them.
What would they have been if I could retrospectively wave a magic wand for you?
Well, I think there are several different areas I would talk about. Firstly, education. Not having had much of it, I'm very much in favour of other people getting it and widening it. I mean, we did, for example, and many people criticised us for this in some ways, I don't know, maybe they were right, giving greater status to the polytechnics, but I was trying to improve the quality, the social ambience surrounding blue-collar work. Certainly a lot of education changes. I would like to have upgraded the education profession. I think in this mercenary age, we would have had to look at the rewards for the top of education as well. So I think it would have been expensive to do what I wished to do, but I believe it would have been right to do it. And I think also I would have looked at the provision of more homes, largely small units in the inner cities. And there's a lot of idle space in and around the cities where I would have wished to provide probably penalties for those who idly hung on to land that ought to be developed for too long, and incentives to people actually to develop. And of course, I would have wanted to make reforms to the health system. Now, I believe with the money that we had built up in the economy by 97, we too, had we won that election, would have put a lot more money into the health service and looked at reforms of the health service. So I shall live with the regret to my dying day that I did not have the wherewithal and was not in a political position to go down the route of those reforms, which were the sort of things I wished to do from the first moment I dreamed of going into politics.
Yeah. Another problem beset your government was the back to basics, which was, I think, misunderstood when you
It
launched
wasn't
it on a
misunderstood. It wasn't misunderstood, Peter. It was distorted. And it was distorted because at that stage the government was the fox and the media were the hounds. In defence of the media, there was, though I did not know it at the time, a young briefer at Central Office who had spoken to people about it being a moral crusade, which it was never intended to be a moral crusade. If you go back to the source speech for Back to Basics, it was predominantly about education and good neighbourliness and community care. And secondly, for the first 3 months of it, it was very popular until events conspired to turn it into a negative. But it was distorted.
Is it possible to have a private life as a modern politician? Because you've suffered very much in that department yourself.
It's increasingly difficult. I admire people who go into politics. I know this isn't fashionable to say at the moment. But most of the politicians I know, and I make no party distinction here, the vast majority of the politicians I have known over the years go into politics for good motives, not bad. I don't subscribe to the lurid version of politicians only being in politics for themselves and for their own interests. That was not my experience during the years I was in politics.
It's a tough, scarring business being Prime Minister, even in relatively benign circumstances, and you didn't have those. I was very struck years ago now when Quentin Hailsham was asked on Radio 4 by Anthony Clare, did he regret not becoming Prime Minister when he was so close to it in '63 in the Macmillan succession? And he said, Hailsham this is, I've known every Prime Minister to a greater or lesser extent since Balfour, and most of them have died unhappy. It doesn't lead to happiness. You happy, John? Will you die happy?
I think, well, I very much hope so. I'm not planning to do so immediately. I shall hope to hang on for a while. I think there's different sorts of Prime Ministers once they leave office. There are those for whom office never quite goes away. There are others to a greater extent, and I hope I'm one of them, who have been able to say, that was yesterday, and I now have other things that I must do with the rest of my life. So the advice I would give to anyone who wishes to be Prime Minister is when it is over, there is a very remarkable world out there. Try and see it and try and make up for the things you necessarily and rightly had to sacrifice when you were in politics.
Finally, John, how do you think history will remember you, and how do you want history to remember you? Is there a gap between the two?
I have no idea, but the great comfort is I won't be here to find out.
John Major, thank you very much.